Hi everybody, this is Dino Chris from Prehistoric Facts. I'm going to do 2 extra episodes today, so hopefully I can get them uploaded either tonight or otherwise maybe tomorrow morning. So it just depends on basically how the computer is going to be working here. But anyway, the first Prehistoric Facts episode I'm going to be talking about basically for this episode, this extra episode here, would actually be about the Bone Wars. And basically what the Bone Wars is basically a feud between two paleontologists from the 1800s. And these paleontologists are Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. How the Bone Wars actually kind of began was basically this. Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh were basically colleagues. Basically, they were colleagues before they actually started their feud. So they were friends before they actually started fighting with each other. And you see, they were well-respected scientists during that time, but they were also kind of young. They were kind of young. They were kind of actually understanding paleontology as a whole. And so, how this actually began is basically this: is that when Marsh actually asked Edward Drinker Cope to actually take a look at a New Jersey quarry, basically they actually has loads of fossils, pretty much from dating back in the Mesozoic. And so he agreed. Cope actually agreed and actually showed Charles Marsh basically the quarry and met with the owner, and then pretty much within, I think it was between 2 days to a week, Cope actually found out that his fossil supply in this New Jersey quarry dried up. And what happened was that Charles Marsh actually bribed the owner of the land, the owner of the quarry, to actually have Charles Marsh dig up and have Charles Marsh's team dig up all the fossils that are actually in this quarry. And Cope was not very happy about that. He felt that Charles Marsh actually stabbed him in the back, basically betrayed him. And this is how the feud actually began. And so this is actually how this actually got started. But then it was years later when Edward Drinker Cope was actually putting together the skeleton of this giant marine reptile from the Cretaceous called Elasmosaurus. And basically he made a very conscious mistake. He actually put the Elasmosaurus skull at the end of the tail instead of the end of the very long neck. It's because basically Cope thought that it was basically how it's supposed to be, and thought that this long appendage, that was the long appendage that has lots of vertebrae, was basically a tail. So he thought that Elasmosaurus probably actually used that tail kind of like a rudder. But what Charles Marsh actually found out was that he realized that one of the vertebrae in the neck actually has the basically kind of like that knob, basically on the back of the, basically where the skull attaches to the neck, a little axle joint basically. And he actually presented this to the scientists in the Philadelphia Museum of Science of Science, and pretty much the Philadelphia and Cope's Philadelphia colleagues really actually took Marsh's word and realized that yes, Marsh is right. And so Cope felt humiliated, and he pretty much thought that Marsh was actually really trying to take Cope down by actually discrediting him, trying to take all the fossils that he wants, and all that. But basically, Marsh was actually kind of doing it in a very different way than other paleontologists and geologists were actually doing in terms of collecting fossils. Is basically he was doing it as a business sense. Basically, he was kind of using a businessman type of method. Basically, is actually kind of give a sales pitch and pretty much actually say, I'll give you this much if you actually give me this. That was actually how he actually did this. Whereas Cope, he actually wanted to do it in terms of the scientific type of point, and he actually wanted to actually discover as many species as possible. Charles Marsh actually did this as well, but basically he actually didn't actually really have a lot of hand in terms of the science, but basically he did actually help out a lot in terms of the science of paleontology and so on. And basically, Charles Marsh actually went out to basically the Great Plains and also the Rocky Mountains, and pretty much realized that there could be fossils there that that scientists haven't found there yet. And so basically, he gathered all students that actually wanted to join him from Yale, and pretty much went on this excavation. And it was kind of actually funny how some of these students who have never actually been out in the wilderness that much, which basically these guys actually had basically their parents' wealth and all that sorts of stuff, so they didn't really have to go out to see the wilderness that much. And so having them dressed up like cowboys and all that sorts of stuff, that was kind of actually a interesting way to look at it. But basically, Cope actually got rumor of this, and basically he thought, you know what, if he's going out there, I'll go out there. And so that's how he actually thought, that if he wants to get any hands on some new fossils, he has to take that chance. And so it was pretty much going all the way towards... So they pretty much stumble upon the Great Plains. I believe they were in Nebraska, if I remember correctly. And when they actually got to Nebraska, they were actually searching around rock beds that are basically dating back to the age of mammals, basically the Eocene or Oligocene. And they actually found some of the same species. And you see, there was another paleontologist out there named Joseph Leidy. And Joseph Leidy basically was out there too, but he actually discovered the animal first. And so pretty much, when these two were actually fighting over naming rights, it was pretty much a complete mess, to say the least. Just because you see, Cope and Marsh wanted to actually discredit one the other, and pretty much actually say no, I discovered it first. I should name the species. But basically, Leidy got there first, and pretty much actually tried to convince the scientific community that these guys got there pretty much a day or two later, and pretty much Leidy actually had discovered these bones first, and he got the naming rights, and he named this species, this weird-looking mammal species, Uintatherium. And so that was actually a big bitter war between Leidy, Cope, and Marsh. But basically what Marsh and Cope did was that they made a total mess of this. They actually named the same exact species, gave different names, because they thought that they could actually discredit Leidy's claim, and basically the scientific community didn't believe it for a while, and then pretty much the names kind of stuck for a little while, and then pretty much once more research was done, it was actually clear that Marsh and Cope were just making a mess, and they just discredited Marsh and Cope's names of this Uintatherium. And so they pretty much got discredited for that. And pretty much it was until the mid-1800s, it was when you actually start to see the bone wars really start to clash out. It got really personal. And so once there was a fossil collector who actually saw some massive bones coming out of the rocks from Colorado, he sent a shipment to both Neil Charles Marsh and also to Edward Drinker Cope. So basically, it was basically separate shipments, and basically Marsh and Cope actually thought, like, you know what, I'm going to go out there and actually going to get these fossils. And so another thing that Marsh and Cope did out in the field is that they actually dug excavations so close to each other that basically they had spies basically watching out over who was digging what. You know, that was kind of the thing. And basically with Edward Drinker Cope, he was finding theropod dinosaurs. He was actually finding Permian reptiles. He was also finding marine reptiles. Whereas Cope was actually he was finding pterosaurs. He was finding some sauropods, and found Stegosaurus and ceratopsians and some theropods. But basically, he did not find a theropod for a while until Cope actually found a theropod, and basically Marsh's team actually snuck in at night and pretty much took all the bones and actually just say that they were mine. And Cope actually almost did the same thing, where basically he took some of Marsh's findings and basically said, hey, they were mine. And so what happened was that, but also what they did, it was actually, if they found any more fossils that were actually right near where they were digging, and pretty much both of them actually say, destroy them, so that way my rival does not find this, and we'll come back next time, and we'll try to actually excavate this. And so it got really, really personal when Marsh actually tried to discredit all of Cope's findings, and basically Cope actually had pretty much left a paper trail of basically everything that he actually found, and also how much money did he use in terms of the excavations, and also what was funded by the Philadelphia Institute of Science. And so that was actually the point there. And they went out to the press with this, and the press actually published like articles in the newspapers. This was even front page news at the time, and it was actually massive. This was the biggest paleontological war between scientists, and this was actually the most bitter war in science that was ever assembled in North America and basically around the world, because you have never heard of anything like this before. Two scientists clashing over who's right, who's wrong, and who gets credit for some discoveries. And you see, Marsh actually became the president of paleontology at the United States Geological Survey that was actually used to be in Washington, D.C. And so he tried to actually take Cope's findings and basically try to say they belong in museums and all that. But basically, Cope actually said, no, they're mine. I have evidence to prove it. And so Cope went to court with this, and he was nearly bankrupt to do this. But basically, Cope managed to do it, and he did actually win his case. It's just that Cope did actually had to give up some fossils, so that way they were actually going to be considered, they could be going to museums. But when the government actually found out that that basically Marsh was actually laundering money to actually do like everything is possible to do, to keep the paleontological part of the U.S. Geological Society afloat, and he actually did have a lot of, and Charles Marsh wrote a lot of books, Cope wrote a lot of books about certain discoveries. And basically the government actually used one of Marsh's books, is basically called Birds with Teeth. And it was basically from an Alabama senator who actually said that, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that why are we spending so much money on this thing that is birds with teeth? And so pretty much the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate and U.S. senators basically said, you know what, you're right. Let's actually slash their budget so that way that basically they don't actually have total control over the government. And that was a big fear for politicians back then, was when scientists were actually having more power than the politicians. And so that was actually a big problem for them. And so they actually slashed the budget of the U.S. Geological Survey, and pretty much the head of the U.S. Geological Survey actually had no choice but to cut the paleontology program, and pretty much Marsh was actually forced to actually give up some of his findings that he had at Yale University. But you see, he didn't do a really good job of actually keeping track of what is what and all that, and pretty much he didn't do a very good job like Cope did. And so Cope, when he found this out, he felt like that Marsh got what he deserved. It was basically felt humiliated by the government, and pretty much actually should realize that what he's doing is not really the right way to do it. And so, and all that. But basically, both of them died, basically a fear of that either one of them could take either one of their findings. But you see, Cope was one of the scientists that actually helped Charles Knight to actually become one of the greatest paleo artists of all time. And that was actually basically Cope gave Knight his personal journal, and he wrote details of how some of these animals actually lived. And it was amazing for him to actually do that. But even though he told Knight that when you're done, please make sure you actually put it underneath my bed, so that way nobody actually sees this, and I'll actually stay right here until I die to make sure that nobody steals it. And so how it happened. He died in his deathbed. And Charles Marsh, he got pneumonia and pretty much died of complications with that. But even though these men helped out paleontology a lot, though, they actually discovered like numerous species, and they actually helped Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and all that sorts of stuff. They were revolutionary at that point. But even though with their bitter feud, they did make a mess, and pretty much it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century is when we actually start to see the scientists that actually did the work properly and actually discovered animals, that actually discovered new species of ancient beasts that we actually come to know and love as life goes on. And basically, science has actually learned from this, and pretty much actually says that if you have a disagreement, it's fine. You can disagree all you want, but it's just that don't go overboard with this, just like what Marsh and Cope did. Don't go overboard with that. Just basically say we can agree to disagree, and we'll just go on from there, because that's part of science. If basically you come up with a theory, and if there's a scientist that says, I don't agree with your theory, I think there's some holes in this theory, and basically that scientist said, I respect that. I respect that you actually have a different view about this, and if you want to take a chance on looking over the evidence, feel free. It's just that it's basically just don't copy what I did. That's basically how it goes. Alright, that's it for the Bone Wars episode. I'll actually tape another episode, and this will be controversial theories or discoveries in paleontology. So I'll do this next one in a little bit. So see you in a little bit.